This is not a work of science, it's a work of science and art.
I gotta be honest, some of these ideas are a little science fiction sounding.
It will solve problems unsolvable by the combined power of all the world's compute today.
Why would one of the world's biggest tech companies suddenly pull the plug on its most secretive quantum project? Today, we're going to explore exactly what happened. Why Microsoft's quantum lab was suddenly shut down, and what role the company's flashy new Majorana 1 chip might play in the story.
Our first quantum processor based on this architecture is the Majorana 1.
We'll also dig into some speculative theories that people can't stop whispering about. Let's go back to where it all began, the rise of Microsoft's quantum dream. In the world of technology, Microsoft is a name everyone knows. For decades, the company has been associated with operating systems, software, and the cloud. But around 2017, they decided to place a bet on something much bigger: quantum computing. While companies like Google and IBM were showing off early prototypes of noisy, error-prone quantum machines, Microsoft wanted to play the long game. Their idea was to build the right kind of quantum computer, one that could scale to millions of qubits without collapsing under its own errors. The strategy centered on something called topological qubits. Most qubits, the basic building blocks of quantum machines, are incredibly fragile. They collapse when disturbed by the slightest vibration, temperature fluctuation, or interference. But Microsoft believed that by using exotic particles called Majorana 0 modes, they could create qubits that were far more stable. If they pulled it off, it would be like skipping ahead several decades in the race. To pursue this moonshot, Microsoft created Station Q, a global network of research partnerships. And one of the brightest stars in that network was the Microsoft Quantum Lab in Sydney, Australia, launched in partnership with the University of Sydney. This was no ordinary collaboration. The lab was housed in the cutting-edge Nanoscience Hub, a facility designed to push the limits of what's physically possible. Leading the effort was Professor David Riley, a physicist with deep expertise in both theory and engineering. From the very beginning, the mission was bold: create the hardware that could scale quantum systems beyond just a few qubits. Everyone in the field knew that building a small quantum computer was possible. IBM had already demonstrated systems with a few dozen qubits. But making those machines useful at scale, with thousands or millions of qubits, was a completely different challenge. The Sydney lab became a critical piece of Microsoft's global puzzle. It attracted top scientists and engineers, funded new experiments, and gave Australia a leading role in one of the most important scientific races of our time. And soon, the lab began to deliver breakthroughs and achievements. By 2021, the Sydney Quantum Lab had captured the world's attention with an achievement that seemed almost impossible at the time. They developed a specialized cryogenic chip capable of controlling thousands of qubits simultaneously. For those following quantum computing closely, this was nothing short of groundbreaking. To understand why, you have to remember the state of the field in that era. Most quantum machines were still experimental prototypes, operating with just a few dozen qubits at best. Even the most advanced systems could only push into the low hundreds. And yet, these small machines came with enormous technical baggage. They required complex webs of wires, delicate instruments, and entire rooms of cooling equipment to keep the qubits stable. The challenge was controlling qubits without everything collapsing under noise and error. What the Sydney team accomplished was the equivalent of a technological shortcut. By building a controller on a chip, they made it possible to scale quantum systems in a way no one had thought feasible. Instead of sprawling, room-sized setups, you could imagine something compact, efficient, and directly integrated into a quantum computer. The analogy often used was the early days of classical computing. In the 1940s, computers were monstrous machines that filled entire buildings. They were powerful but impractical. Then the microprocessor came along, a tiny piece of silicon that shrank everything down and set the stage for the personal computer revolution. Microsoft's chip was seen as that same kind of turning point for quantum technology. And this wasn't just an academic curiosity. It was a step toward making quantum computers usable in the real world. Machines that could run complex simulations, crack problems in chemistry and material science, or revolutionize fields like cryptography. For a brief period, all eyes were on Sydney. The excitement wasn't just within Microsoft or Australia's research community. Globally, there was a sense that the first truly scalable quantum computer might emerge from this lab. But with every breakthrough comes a question of follow-through. The world was ready for the next big leap, a working prototype, a live demonstration, some proof that this chip could deliver on its promise. And that's where the momentum started to falter. The achievement put the Sydney lab on the map, but only a few years later, the story would take a sharp turn. What seemed like a steady climb toward quantum dominance suddenly spiraled into confusion, doubt, and ultimately, closure. Microsoft's early quantum promises and controversies. To really understand why Microsoft's shutdown of its Sydney quantum lab sparked so much interest, we need to go back and look at the company's track record in quantum computing. Microsoft didn't just dip its toes into the field, it made some of the boldest promises in the entire tech industry. Back in the early 2000s, when Google and IBM were talking about building qubits with superconductors, Microsoft took a different path. It put its money on something much rarer and harder, topological qubits. The idea was that these qubits, if they could ever be created, would be far more stable than anything else. While everyone else was struggling with error-prone systems, Microsoft promised a shortcut to practical quantum computers. That was a bold claim, but the problem was that for years, there wasn't much to show for it. In 2018, Microsoft published a paper in Nature claiming it had found evidence of the exotic particle needed to build topological qubits, called the Majorana zero mode. The announcement made headlines. People thought it was a huge leap forward. But then, 2 years later, the journal issued a correction. Other scientists reviewing the data said Microsoft's team hadn't really proven what they claimed. The supposed discovery of Majorana particles had been overstated. That retraction was a major embarrassment. For some, it painted Microsoft as a company more interested in headlines than hard science. Critics argued that while Google was demonstrating quantum supremacy experiments and IBM was putting quantum machines on the cloud, Microsoft was still chasing a particle it couldn't even prove existed. Yet Microsoft didn't back down. Instead, it doubled down on its long-term vision. Executives promised that once topological qubits were cracked, they would leap ahead of everyone else. They branded their quantum strategy around the Azure cloud, pitching the future idea of a quantum cloud supercomputer that businesses could one day rent. But with each passing year, the gap between promises and reality seemed to grow. That history matters because it explains why the Sydney lab closure was seen by some as part of a bigger pattern. Microsoft had a reputation for over-promising in quantum, then quietly shifting the narrative when things didn't pan out. For supporters, the shutdown was just a strategic pivot, but for skeptics, it felt like déjà vu. Why Microsoft's strategy still matters. Even with its history of ambitious promises and occasional setbacks, Microsoft's quantum strategy still carries enormous weight in the field. Their focus on topological qubits represents a fundamentally different approach from most competitors. While companies like IBM and Google have pursued noisy qubits that require massive error correction, Microsoft has been chasing a long-term solution that could dramatically reduce complexity and cost if it succeeds. In other words, they're trying to redefine what a practical quantum computer could even look like. Another reason Microsoft's strategy matters is its integration with the Azure quantum platform. This allows developers, researchers, and companies around the world to experiment with quantum-inspired algorithms right now, even if a full-scale topological qubit computer isn't ready yet. By creating an ecosystem for experimentation and education, Microsoft has planted seeds that could pay off massively when their hardware finally catches up. It's a slow build, but one that keeps them relevant in the global race. Finally, Microsoft's approach has a broader impact beyond its own labs. The company's ambitious promises have shaped how governments, universities, and startups allocate resources and focus their research. Even controversies, corrections, and delayed breakthroughs have forced the industry to refine standards, improve transparency, and push the limits of what's possible. So while critics may roll their eyes at past overstatements, the influence of Microsoft's strategy on quantum computing as a whole cannot be ignored. The sudden shutdown. In July 2024, Microsoft shocked the community by announcing the closure of the Sydney Quantum Lab. After 7 years of collaboration, the partnership with the University of Sydney was ending. The official reason given was strategic consolidation. According to Microsoft, it made sense to bring all their quantum research back home, to Redmond, Washington. By centralizing the effort, they argued, the company could streamline operations and focus on the fastest path to commercialization. On the surface, this explanation was simple enough. Big tech companies reorganize projects all the time. But for those inside the quantum community, it raised eyebrows. Why shut down a lab that had delivered such significant breakthroughs? Why withdraw from a country that was quickly becoming one of the most vibrant centers for quantum research? The shutdown left dozens of staff members, scientists, students, and engineers without Microsoft's support. Professor Riley, to his credit, pledged to keep the work going independently. And Australia, with its growing ecosystem, quickly absorbed the setback. But the abrupt nature of the decision left many wondering if something more was going on. Was Microsoft losing patience with the pace of progress? Were internal politics at play? Or was the company preparing for a bigger announcement that would overshadow the closure entirely? The global quantum race. To understand why Microsoft's decision mattered so much, we have to zoom out and see the bigger picture. By the mid-2020s, the race for quantum supremacy was no longer just about science. It had turned into a geopolitical and corporate arms race. Google had already shaken the world back in 2019 when it claimed quantum supremacy, showing off a machine that solved a problem faster than any traditional supercomputer could. IBM wasn't far behind, rolling out larger and larger quantum systems with bold roadmaps that promised to reach 1,000 qubits by the middle of the decade. Meanwhile, China poured billions into its own quantum research programs, unveiling jaw-dropping experiments that sent ripples through Western competitors. And then, there were the startups, names like IonQ, Rigetti, and PsiQuantum, each of them raising eye-watering amounts of money and making daring claims about their breakthroughs. Everyone seemed to be sprinting toward the finish line. But Microsoft? They were oddly quiet. For years, the company had placed its bets on a highly ambitious idea, the topological qubit. It sounded revolutionary, but there were hardly any public results to prove it worked. While other companies were showing off real hardware, giving flashy demos, and even letting people run programs on the cloud, Microsoft mostly leaned on its Azure quantum platform. This allowed developers to tinker with quantum-inspired algorithms, but it wasn't the same as running on true quantum machines. The gap between promises and proof began to grow. Critics started pointing fingers, accusing Microsoft of overhyping its mysterious topological qubits while producing very little evidence. Pressure was building, and many wondered whether Microsoft had bitten off more than it could chew. And that's where the story gets interesting, because just months after shutting down the Sydney lab, Microsoft revealed something that changed the entire conversation: Majorana 1 and qubits. In February 2025, Microsoft unveiled the Majorana 1 chip. It was presented as the company's bold new step into the quantum future. Majorana 1 was described as the world's first quantum chip built with a topological core. In theory, this means it uses exotic particles called Majorana zero modes to create qubits that are far more stable than traditional ones. Why does this matter? Because the Achilles heel of quantum computing is error correction. Regular qubits are so fragile that they require massive amounts of overhead, sometimes thousands of physical qubits to create just one reliable logical qubit. If Microsoft's approach works, it could slash the number of physical qubits needed and make million-qubit systems achievable much sooner. Microsoft claimed that with this breakthrough, the dream of useful, commercial-grade quantum computing could be realized in years, not decades. But here's the catch. Not everyone is convinced. Some scientists noted that Microsoft had made similar claims before, going back to the 2010s. Independent proof that Majorana-based qubits are real and reliable is still scarce. Publications like Nature covered the announcement with cautious optimism, but also skepticism. And this brings us back to the timing. Was the shutdown of the Sydney lab connected to the unveiling of Majorana 1? Did Microsoft want to clean house, consolidate resources, and shift the narrative toward this new chip? It's impossible to say for sure. But the coincidence is striking. To really understand why Microsoft's quantum lab was such a big deal and why its sudden shutdown raised so many eyebrows, we need to take a step back and talk about qubits. In classical computing, everything boils down to bits. A bit is either a 0 or a 1, like a light switch that's either off or on. It's simple, stable, and predictable. But qubits? They don't play by those rules. A qubit is the quantum version of a bit. Instead of being stuck in a single state, a qubit can exist in a superposition, meaning it can be a 0 and a 1 at the same time, until it's measured. Imagine spinning a coin in the air. While it's spinning, it's both heads and tails. Only when it lands do you see the result. That's what a qubit does, but in the world of quantum physics. The impact on Australia and funny rumors. For Australia, Microsoft's withdrawal was disappointing, but not devastating. By the time the Sydney Quantum Lab closed its doors, the country had already built a reputation as one of the rising stars in global quantum research. The Australian government had invested heavily, pouring hundreds of millions into the sector. Programs like Quantum Australia were launched to connect universities, startups, and industry leaders, creating a network that could stand on its own even without Microsoft. The idea was simple: build an ecosystem strong enough that no single company could make or break it. And that strategy was already paying off. Companies like Silicon Quantum Computing and PsiQuantum were setting up shop in Australia, bringing groundbreaking research, jobs, funding, and international recognition. For young scientists, engineers, and entrepreneurs, this meant there were real opportunities at home rather than having to move overseas. At the University of Sydney, the closure of the Microsoft lab didn't mean the end of the road. Professor Riley and his colleagues pledged to keep pushing forward. They still had the expertise, the talent pipeline, and a growing list of local and international collaborators. In a way, Microsoft's exit gave them freedom, no longer tied to a single corporate agenda. They could pursue broader research directions and partnerships. So while losing a big name like Microsoft might have looked like a blow from the outside, inside the quantum community, it was seen more as a turning point. It proved that Australia's quantum ecosystem was strong enough to survive without leaning on one global giant. And in the long run, that independence could make it even stronger. Now let's be clear, everything I've said so far is fact. But alongside the facts, a lot of speculation has been floating around online. And while none of it's proven, it's worth talking about because it adds intrigue to an already fascinating story. One popular rumor is that the lab simply wasn't producing the breakthroughs Microsoft had hoped for. Progress may have slowed, and in a high-stakes race where billions of dollars are on the line, the company decided it was smarter to cut its losses. Another theory is about narrative control. By closing the Sydney lab quietly while loudly announcing the launch of Majorana 1, Microsoft could steer the conversation away from failure and toward breakthrough. It was, some say, less about the science and more about how the story was told. And then there's the talent theory. Australia's booming quantum scene was attracting some of the brightest minds in the world. By pulling out, Microsoft may have avoided competing directly with the very ecosystem it once supported, freeing itself to focus elsewhere. Of course, none of these ideas are confirmed. They're just theories. But they add another layer to a story that's already filled with twists, breakthroughs, and unanswered questions. What it all means for the future. So what does all of this mean? For Microsoft, the future now rests on whether Majorana 1 and its successors can deliver on their bold promises. If they succeed, they could leapfrog competitors and finally prove that the topological qubit approach was worth the wait. If they fail, though, critics will say the Sydney shutdown was just one more sign that the company's quantum strategy was shaky all along. For Australia, the closure marks the end of one chapter, but the beginning of another. With government support, strong universities, and a growing industry, the country could become a global hub for quantum innovation, independent of Microsoft or any single corporate partner. And for the world, the race for quantum supremacy is still wide open. Every company, every country, and every lab is chasing the same dream. A machine powerful enough to transform everything from medicine to materials to cybersecurity. Microsoft's decision is just one twist in a story that is far from over. So here's the bottom line. Microsoft's quantum lab in Sydney really did shut down. The company says it was simply consolidating resources. At the same time, they're betting big on their new Majorana 1 chip, which could either prove revolutionary or end up being another overhyped promise. What's your take? Smart strategy or a hidden story behind the shutdown? Comment below and subscribe for more quantum insights.